In the 19th century, there's a massive reorganization of society around monogamy. That happens because, in part, the colonial state, Christian colonial state, is deeply invested in monogamy as a model of an ideal society, but also because Hindu Brahmins also become invested in that idea of Hindu Brahminical patriarchy as located within the household.
That's Durba Mitra talking about her book, Indian Sex Life, Sexuality and the Colonial Origins of Modern Social Thought. Listen to the full discussion on this episode of BIC Talks.
Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
How did British authorities and Indian intellectuals develop ideas about deviant female sexuality to control and organize society in colonial India? What are the legal and social implications of these ideas that affect us to this day? How did British authorities and Indian intellectuals develop ideas about deviant female sexuality to control and organize society in colonial India? What are the legal and social implications of these ideas that affect us to this day? Durba Mitra talks to Sreeparna Chattopadhyay on this episode of BIC Talks. Durba is the Carol K. Pforzheimer Assistant Professor at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University. Talking to her is Sreeparna Chattopadhyay, an independent gender studies researcher based in Bangalore. She got her PhD in anthropology and population studies from Brown University, and she's been researching gender, health, family kinship, and gender-based violence for the last 12 years. Hi Durba, welcome to BIC Talks. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
And Sreeparna, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for anchoring this conversation. And I want to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Pavan. Hello, Durba. It's been a great pleasure to read your book. It's fascinating and insightful for a multitude of different reasons. I will first let you open up with why you chose to study Indian Sex Life, which is the title of your book, and what prompted you to do an intellectual history of the prostitute. And for our readers who are uninitiated, perhaps we can also define what an intellectual history is of a concept.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And also, it's particularly important for me to have broad audiences for this book because of what I think are the contemporary significance of this project. And so, the hope is when you write a book over many years is that it will find an audience because you care about the issues. And it's really lovely to be here with you, Sreeparna, because I know you're also a person who loves and deeply thinks about these questions. And so it's a real privilege. As you said, it's a history book. It's a book on the history of gender and sexuality in India, but also a history of how we think about how we study and understand social life. And the book, Indian Sex Life, Sexuality and the Colonial Origins of Modern Social Thought, carries this kind of heavy, provocative title, which has been a source of some hilarious conversation. Some people really don't like the title, obviously, and I've had some trolls and people responding to the title feeling like this is meant to be intentionally provocative. But the funny thing, of course, is that the title comes from a series of books written in India 100 years ago. And so just to note that, the book is really about how the study of Indian sexuality is formative to how we think about Indian society. And that's why the title is seemingly provocative, but it's not meant to be as provocative as we might imagine. I started this project when I was in college and I grew up in the United States. And I am the daughter of a single mother who experienced extraordinary forms of domestic violence and difficulty when she was growing up in India. And she eventually left a marriage and came to the US alone with 2 children. And that experience of migration was one entirely formed or organized by her experience of her marginalization and the kind of exclusion that she felt as a woman within her community. She grew up in Kolkata. And the difficulties that she faced because of the perception of her eventually as a divorced woman and the perceptions of her sexuality. And so the project is a deeply personal one, as these projects tend to be. It's a project that tries to ask the question of why is it that women's social and sexual exclusion is so common in everyday life in Indian communities, in Kolkata, across India, and how do we understand that control of women's sexuality as kind of foundational to the way we think about what's good and what's proper in our society. And then I went to do a PhD, and I thought that I was studying maybe the history of women's medicine. And the more I studied the history of women's medicine, the more I realized I had to understand women's sexuality, because the history of women, the science of women, was so deeply and intimately linked to the control and ideas about the control of women's sexuality. So that's how the kind of project started. And then I ended up doing a lot of archival research across India, across London, across the US, to try to understand, what is a seemingly natural problem, meaning we think of the control of women's sexuality as something that's always been there, that is something that doesn't have a history. And so the question for me was, how do you write a history of something that seems so natural and so primary in how we understand our societies?
And so universal too, right? Across every society, every culture, every religion.
Exactly. So it's really difficult to think, like, how do you study something that seems so obvious and so natural? And how do you, in the language of how we would say in academia, how do you denaturalize it? How do you reveal its historical specificities? And so that's kind of the work that I set out to do. But I think of it as a project that starts with contemporary problems in the present, moves back to ask those questions, and then moves forward to say, what is it then we can say about the contemporary world we live in now?
So since we are on the issue of the contemporary problems in India, so my reading of your book is that your work is very important for the way in which we see a host of contemporary problems in India. So the problems of rampant sexual violence, especially against women who belong to Dalit, Bahujan and Adivasi communities in our country, the non-criminalization of marital rape, the continued vilification of women who exercise agency, sexual or otherwise, the suppression of sexual minorities in the country, and both legal and extra-legal punishments for marriages of choice. You may have read about the recent law against this so-called love jihad issue. So for someone who is interested in reading your book to deconstruct the most urgent problems related to gender and sexual expression in India, what suggestions would you have for how they approach the book and your work more generally? Because your work, I know, is much wider than just the book alone, and you've written also about how forensic and medical evidence is treated in legal jurisprudence in rape cases. So how would you advise them to approach the book?
Thank you so much for that question. I'll start with how you ended it, which was around the question of how medical evidence works in rape cases. So my colleague who's at National Law School in Bangalore, Mrinal Satish, and I did an extensive research project some years ago where we looked at every high court case of rape in India and how medical evidence functioned in those cases, particularly evidence of ideas about women's virginity and how the body was meant to testify to the idea of whether a woman is a virgin or not. And there's kind of multiple ways that this happens. In particular, it happens through the testing of, lining in the vagina known as the hymen. And the idea that the hymen, proof of the hymen demonstrates a woman is a virgin. And then it also happens through something which has produced a lot of debate, which is called the finger test, which is used...
The two-finger test.
Yeah, the two-finger test, exactly, which is used across India, but it also was until very recently used in Pakistan. It actually just got outlawed. There is a recommendation to get rid of the finger test in Pakistan, which is an ongoing litigation that's happening in the Lahore High Court and more.
And it's outlawed in India as well, right? If I understand it correctly.
So no, it was to be. So after the 2012 Delhi rape case, it was meant, the recommendations of the Verma committee were that, right? Because my colleague, Professor Satish, actually sat on the Verma committee, and Pratiksha Bakshi, these very important scholars based in Delhi, based in Bangalore. And the recommendation was that it would be outlawed, but it in fact is not. And one of the things that we argued, it is outlawed by state. Some states have stopped using it, but it's not.
There hasn't been an amendment to the Jurisprudence Act itself to outlaw it. Okay.
Exactly. And if you look at the education in medical schools or the education of anyone related to forensic evidence, that one of the things that you find, and this was our intervention in some ways, is that in the medical textbooks, you find that they still mandate or require the use of the finger test. And so one of the reasons that we looked at some of these questions was, that even when it's outlawed sometimes in the jurisprudence, the medical mandates or the medical procedures don't change. And so that's why we were publishing and writing about it, essentially to say, this is not actually evidence. People imagine this is scientific, but it's not. And it's a test of virginity. It's not a test of actually an act of sexual violence or an act of rape has happened. And there's many reasons for this, but part of the reason that I, as a historian or a person who's historically minded, was thinking with a scholar who works on more contemporary issues is because the reason that those textbooks use mandates like the finger test, like testing the hymen, is because of 19th century mandates or ideas about women's sexuality and the definition of rape. So one of the key elements, and you know this very well from your own scholarship, is penal code. When it's passed in 1961, it mandates that rape requires penetration. And so these are very detailed legal juristic-y things, but meaning how do you prove that someone has committed an act of penetration? This is an ongoing problem. And so we see it from the 1970s in the Mathura rape case, that the question of her habituation to sexual intercourse, that language that was used for this poor young girl, essentially, in a custodial rape case, that language of habituation is actually taken from the medical textbook. More recently, the Hathras rape case is a good, gives you a sense of how critically relevant the question of forensic evidence and evidence functions. It was really painful to look at the way that this extraordinary violent act, this atrocity happened, and the way that it was reported in Indian media and afterwards by the police and otherwise, where everyone became a judge and jury, essentially, about whether or not this poor girl had been raped. And, the question, of course, is there was no question that there was an extraordinary act of violence done onto this young girl, essentially. I'm going to call her a girl because I want to mark out how vulnerable she was as a Dalit girl, and also how everything became about whether or not she was raped, because the police reported that she had not been raped because the medical evidence said that she had not been. Now, mind you, she had been killed. And so, there's no denying the extraordinary violence that had happened to her. And yet everything, all of the media, compounded this kind of obsession about the medical evidence in the case. And then, of course, very unfortunately, the police then proceeded to cremate the body before any kind of familial ability to, for funeral rites or otherwise. So there's a reason that they cremate the body is because of the medical evidentiary forms that the body could prove. And so the body comes to have this overly magnified existence in the world. And instead of us talking about the life of this young person and the life that she lived and her dreams and the kind of social world that she inhabited and what she imagined for her life, we end up talking about her body, whether there was evidence of penetration. Everything becomes kind of magnified on the body. So in the middle of my book, one of the things that I explore is the rise of this idea of forensic evidence itself and the way that a woman's body enters narratives, so that we only end up talking about women's bodies and we never talk about women's lives. And it kind of overemphasizes the role of the body in understanding womanhood.
One of the ways in which I have at least interpreted this problem is that it almost seems like sexual violence in India does not count unless it's horrific and it's brutal. And I think after the Nirbhaya case in 2012, where the violence that was visited upon her was so horrific and so brutal, like I couldn't read it. And I think that that's sort of unfortunately set the bar for how bad it has to be for people to take cognizance of the fact that there was this level of violence perpetrated on a body, dehumanized to this extent. And going back to the book itself, one of the things that I thought I will ask you is, at some point in the book, you write that by the logic, both logic of colonial officers as well as logic of these social analysts, people who were Indian elite men who were doing the so-called research on women's sexuality and sex life in India, all Indian women could be classified as prostitutes. So I was wondering whether, when you were doing your research, you were also surprised by how this bewildering group of women were, sort of put into this bracket where they could all aware or they could become prostitutes at some point.
It is bewildering, but also the funny thing is there's a kind of intuitive response, right? Where how often the abuse of the idea of using, the abuse prostitute is used for all kinds of women, whether you're upper caste widow and so it feels familiar, especially if you're a woman and you have been in India, what it's like to experience the kind of sexual abuse that happens, right? The kind of abuse around these kinds of terms, these kind of derogatory ideas. So in one way, it's intuitive. On the other side, you're exactly right. It was bewildering. And that was, in fact, that bewilderment, that experience of epiphany, I call, what is abut, was actually the organizing principle of the book. So part of the question was, when I went and did research, was why are so many kinds of women perceived as prostitutes? And, when in the book, I describe it as really all women, especially those women outside of Brahmin marriage, essentially, everyone except the Brahmin woman, and even the Brahmin woman, especially when she becomes a widow. So that included Devadasis, of course, the courtesan or, high caste Hindu widows, certainly women who were indentured at the time, beggars particularly, and of course the dasi, or the woman who comes and works, that domestic servant who works in your household, right? That idea, there's so many short stories, so many novels about the idea of the servant woman who comes into the household but is sexually lascivious. There is, any kind of woman who was working in public. And at the time, whether you're a nurse or an industrial worker, you're working in a jute mill, all of these women are imagined as by the colonial state and soon by these Bengali Brahmins primarily, but Bengali upper caste men as prostitutes. Now, I think that has to do with the flexibility of that idea of prostitute, meaning really what the concern was the control of female sexuality. And so the term prostitute came to designate any woman who was not acting in the proper way, not behaving as a good ideal wife should. It's a term that actually designates who you are not in some ways. So the book starts with this idea of the prostitute, but it really moves from that to really being about why are we so concerned with the control and the erasure of women's sexuality? So it becomes much broader than just the question of who is considered prostitute, to be really about the fact that there is an overwhelming concern in both colonial administrative policies, but also by anti-colonial nationalist men in controlling women's sexuality. How can we understand that contradiction?
Which kind of brings me to the next question, that certainly the dominant discourse in India for a time, and even now that's conservative, especially Hindu conservative ideologues would say it, which is that the period of British colonialism and the Muslim conquest of India prior to it was what caused the downfall of the status of women. Because prior to that, if you look at our ancient texts, women had a lot of sexual freedom and agency. They could marry whoever they wanted to, etc. So I think your book is especially important and insightful because it emphasizes the importance of philology or written literary texts and records in these kinds of conceptualization.
Absolutely. I think after the introduction of the book, the first chapter of the book explores exactly what you said, which is the way modern social scientists, legal jurists, all kinds of men look to ancient texts or kind of very conservative interpretations of Sanskrit text to make prescriptive ideas or prescriptive laws of what should organize modern society around particularly the control of women's sexuality. And so I start there on purpose because, as you know very well, the logic of a kind of, as you said, Hindu majoritarian vision, which imagines or romanticizes a pre-modern ancient past as a place where Hinduism reigned free and Hindu society was, a deeply civilized, extraordinary society. That logic is so often used by the Hindu right now to justify anti-Muslim policies. And again, this will go back to love jihad. So you can, and I'll come back to that question in a second, but so you can see that there's a kind of strange time logic that's part of these texts and these kind of studies that say we can look to our ancient past to understand our present and our future. And that was a really interesting idea to me, but also something that you see again and again, right? So why is it that Manusmriti is the primary organizational tool to create what is known as Hindu marriage law in India now? And the way that these ancient texts, particularly Manusmriti, stands in law, in society, in institutions, is extraordinary. There's a reason that Brahminical patriarchy is so institutionalized, and it has to do with 150 years ago, there were lawmakers, both in the colonial and among Indian Brahmins, who were collaborating to institutionalize those legal structures, those social structures, those scientific structures around Brahminical patriarchy. So part of what I try to show is that they look to these ancient texts to find reasons why Brahminical patriarchy is the best social form. And as you said, one of the major arguments is one, that in Hindu law, in a very conservative patriarchal interpretation of Hindu texts, so-called Hindu texts, that there you can find the best version of Indian society before it was, as you said, poisoned by colonialism and then, of course, Muslim rule. And one of the things that you find, the argument about so-called Muslim despotism or Muslim conquest is used over and over again as the reasoning, the explanatory reason for why women have become prostitutes in India. And we see that logic now, right? So the forced conversion, that historical narrative about forced conversion is the justification for why India becomes colonized by the British. And you see that logic over and over again in the types of things that I study in the book, because basically the explanation for why women's sexuality is uncontrolled is because Muslims conquered India, and so therefore their kind of lascivious and so-called backward ideas about sexuality came to dominate India because they forcibly converted Hindu women into Islam. That logic is literally, as you know very well, proliferating in our contemporary moment, right? And of course, in Uttar Pradesh, the so-called love jihad, it's such a painful phrase. It's a violent term to even describe the laws, but to use the word love in this way is such an perversion of the idea. But the language of the law is about forcible conversion. And what they do is they use language like allurement, and they use a language like enticement. That language is actually from the Indian Penal Code itself. And that language was used 150 years ago to justify why, supposedly Hindu women had become prostitutes, but also why Muslim despotism was such an extraordinary violence committed unto India.
I want to go to two social groups in your book, which, because you spend a considerable amount of time discussing them. So in the book, there are two social groups which are singled out for special attention for control of female sexual deviance in Bengal. One are the Kulin Brahmins, and the second group are Muslims, both of whom practiced polygamy. So the reasoning was, of course, very different. In the case of Kulin Brahmins, it was because women were not required to cohabit with their husbands and could continue living in their natal family. And in the case of Muslim families, it was because Muslim men allegedly kept multiple wives in the same home. And in addition to women who they may not have formally married, rendering all Muslim marriages, as sort of temporary marriage. I think that's one of the things that you say in the book that was generally the view. Why do you believe there was such immense preoccupation, especially among upper caste Hindu men, with these two social groups in relation to restraining female sexuality only within the ambit of a patriarchal monogamous marriage?
So I think that in the late 19th century, we see this not only in India, but in many spaces that were colonized, a rapid reorganization of society around the patriarchal household. And both of these structures, these familial structures, any kind of familial structure that was outside of Hindu upper caste monogamous marriage was seen as deviant, dangerous, and condemnable. And we see this language all the way through even today, right? When people talk about, for example, Dalit social practices of Dalit women, where the people, again and again describe Dalit women as sexually lascivious or sexually deviant. And because they participate in sexual behaviors that are not long-term monogamy, for example. We see this in Lavani dancing, particularly, like the condemnation of other ways of being in the world. In the 19th century, there's a massive reorganization of society around monogamy. That happens because, in part, the colonial state, Christian colonial state, is deeply invested in monogamy as a model of an ideal society, but also because Hindu Brahmins also become invested in that idea of Hindu Brahminical patriarchy as located within the household. And one of the incredible insights that scholarship on colonial India has given us, and I'm thinking here in particular of the scholarships of many feminist historians, scholars like Partha Chatterjee, who's a historian and a political theorist of India, who tell us about how part of the reason the household becomes this incredibly politicized site is because Brahmin men begin to have a lot of autonomy, political autonomy in the household. And so the claim over the household and the claim over one's wife was critical to a new patriarchy that's being invented in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by upper caste men. And so part of the reason they then begin to have these social reform movements, these movements against other kinds of behavior, whether it's Dalit marriage practices or Vaishnav marriage practices where women had more access to divorce. This is especially in Bengal, or like you said, Muslim polygamy, and particularly in this case, Kulin Brahmin polygamy, which is very upper caste. It's the highest subcaste within the Brahmins in Bengal in the 19th century. The reason that all of these become a site of kind of critique is it doesn't fit into this ideal notion of upper caste Hindu monogamy, which becomes idealized more and more. And so there's all of these social campaigns to get rid of these social practices. And part of the way that these campaigns are successful is that they condemn the women in these marriages, in these other social practices, women performers, as prostitutes. And they say again and again, if you don't control your woman, she will inevitably stray from your household and become the prostitute, because a woman cannot control her own sexuality. A man must control her sexuality. And that is essential to the progress of India. That's the language that they're using in a lot of the things that they're writing at the time. That logic of a woman's sexuality requires the control of men. And it's an interesting logic because it says that women's freedom comes through the control of their sexuality. So it uses the language, again, of liberation, paradoxically, to say we can give women freedom by controlling them within the household. It's a strange logic. Anyway, so that idea of giving women liberation through monogamous marriage is used again and again, and it's very logical. Like, you can see that language all over India today. The idea that the woman who is outside of Hindu marriage has nothing, that she's dangerous. There's a reason that marriage is the predominant way we think about organizing our society. It's so critical that a woman who doesn't get married is seen as an absolute anomaly and also seen as dangerous.
And this kind of reminds me of, the parallels with Nair women in Kerala, where Nair women had these informal relationships and a huge amount of sexual agency, where they could form these relationships called sambandham, and they had their own household, the tarwad, and they stayed in their natal family. And with the advent of Victorian style education for Nair men, most of whom prior to that were engaged in fighting, because a lot of the historically the profession has been to fight in wars, found suddenly that they had to restrain their women and bring them under the monogamous marriage that you see in other parts of Hindu India, because it became an index of civilizational progress, right? So if you're not within this monogamous Hindu marriage, then you are somehow considered backward. And I think that even today, these ideas about women's unrestrained sexuality, or that the fact that they are naturally available, which you see pervading the consciousness of upper caste Hindu when they think of tribal women, or when they think of women from Dalit and Bahujan communities, it's there everywhere. And that's often used to justify sexual violence against them as well, where, the fact that it's just considered that they are easily available because historically that has been the case. So it's very interesting in the way, like you said, that the logic of it, the rationality behind it is that it's only through controlling women's sexuality that you give them liberation, or the other option left to them, which you find in the autobiographies of prostitutes between the 1920s and 1940s, which to me were quite sort of, heart-rending, because they do reveal the contradictions, critiquing the hypocrisy of the so-called respectable men who engaged in ever more strict regulation of women's sexuality during the daytime through alleged social reform, and of course visited them during the nighttime on the other hand. And the idea that the prostitute could only be liberated if they turned into a life of complete austerity and deprivations by becoming an ascetic. So there were not many options left for women. You either become a monk, an ascetic, or you resign yourself to compulsory monogamous marriage. And even women who chose, like in Vaishnavism, and who chose to become sort of traveling seers and saints, it's not as if that they were free of this taint, right? Because even that option in some cases was looked down upon as a woman who was loose. So I was wondering, when you were sort of reading these autobiographies of these women, do you feel that these kinds of logic and these kinds of understandings of what the options are for women are pervading the discourses around women's freedoms, not just sexual freedom, but any kind of freedom in India even today?
Absolutely. I think one of the phrases that I use in the book, which is taken from African American studies and Caribbean studies, is a phrase that Orlando Patterson used to talk about enslaved people many, many years ago, the phrase social death. The idea that one is supposed to experience social death, right? And we know this firsthand, right, in the experience of widows, that deprivation is the defining feature of especially the Brahmin widow. But of course, we also know that what happens over the course of the 20th century is that all kinds of castes, lower caste and upper caste people, began to put restrictions on widows to make them live a life of social death, essentially, where you're living, but your life is not meant to have any kind of experience of joy or pleasure or desire. All of those things are meant to be stripped from you so that you live a life, but also often in servitude of sorts to the family and otherwise.
You're just existing. You're just allowed to exist in some ways.
Exactly. So how do we understand an existence without desire or an existence without pleasure? And that's an interesting question for me. That's what I explore at the end of the book. What are the possibilities of freedom for women? As you said, there are these very limited ideas of what a woman could do. If you are not living a life of degradation, a woman who's supposedly fallen, then you are either that or you go to Varanasi and you become an ascetic, essentially. Like the limitations of what your life can be is extraordinary. And
even there, you might be sexually exploited, right? So it's not as if going away to Banaras to become a Krishna Bhakt is going to save you. Which, when I read the book, what struck me as really quite shocking is this is that there was so little understanding of the social complexity and, the kind of the ways in which women were forced into such situations. You mentioned this in the afterword, that there was a speculation about what women's lives were and why they became what they became. But it seemed as if they were inhabiting a completely different universe where they had zero understanding of what is it that women had to put up with and bear with, even within the confines of a marriage. It was mentioned in passing that, she ran away from home because, in the case of the nurse's autobiography who became a prostitute, because she had been gang raped by 6 men over a period of a week and then sent back to her parents' house.
I mean, and I think one of the things that you just mentioned, I think is really important, right? Which is that the woman who goes to Benares, who having become a widow, she's perceived as sexually deviant. Even as you said, in some ways, the spectrum between deviancy, what is perceived as a woman being transgressive or inappropriate, and exploitation, that when a woman is raped, she's perceived as sexually inappropriate or sexually deviant. And because of the kind of way in which we blame women for their own sexuality, even blame them for the exploitation of their own bodies, that logic is what's so striking to me. And part of the intention of the book is to ask, what is a vision of freedom that doesn't look like this? What is a way of imagining the world where freedom is not, as we were describing, a woman's liberation doesn't happen within the household by becoming an ideal mother, where she could exist in public space without the fear of violence, without the fear of harassment, and without the fear of being condemned for being in public. What kind of life is that? And at the end of the book, as you mentioned, I turned to Rokeya Sakawat Hussein's very lovely short story from 1905, Sultana's Dream. And I looked to Sultana's Dream, this short story that so many of us know, that so many of us love, that we think of as a fantasy, right? It tells the story of this lady land where women rule the public space and they are the governing body, and men stay inside the household. And women are the ones who produce science and new environments and dream of a new world, and men take care of the children and stay inside. And I ask, why is it that imagination is imagined as a fantasy, where women can inhabit public space and redefine what governance is and reimagine what science is? Why is that a fantasy? And what these men write, where they see the control of women's sexuality as the primary way to imagine a future for India, a future for Indian society, for Hindu society, really. Why is that not a fantasy? Why do they get to institutionalize that vision? Meaning these men, first colonial officials and then upper caste Hindu men. Why do they get to implement that vision, whereas women have no power to implement a different vision of their freedom? And so really, I think, the more I think about it after having written the book, I think the urgent feminist question for all of us is, what is the work that we can do together to imagine a new kind of freedom for ourselves? What does freedom look like outside of these constraints? And it's a difficult question, but one that I think is more and more urgent today.
And the question of freedom, even the freedom to practice sex work, and I'm going to use the term sex work instead of prostitute because most sex workers would not relate to that term, is that there has been a lot of discussions around amending the Immoral Trafficking and Prevention Act because it conflates trafficking with voluntary sex work. And one of the problems has been in trying to separate voluntary sex work from trafficking is that you have this ideology that women would not voluntarily practice sex work had they had other choices. I don't have a position on that, but what I do think from having spoken to many sex workers is that they don't come to sex work as necessarily a first choice because there is not enough availability of decent livelihood options for women with not enough skills, not enough high skills. Or it's still some of the narratives that are there in your book where, women run away from from an abusive marriage, or they are poor and they are, they don't have anyone to take care of themselves, and therefore they choose to do sex work. Nevertheless, there is some element of choice in that, but we have been stuck in this deadlock where we are not able to come to any kind of conclusion or any kind of remedial measures for sex workers in India, where the element of choice is just being taken away, and it's all constructed within this discourse of, exploitation and trafficking. When you say that, can we imagine a different world where, women don't have to be in the confines of a monogamous, compulsory heterosexual marriage in order to be considered respectable women? Is, I think, the notion of what is respectable and what is respectable profession. And even today, sex work is one extreme of it. There are many professions where, parents will warn their daughters to not get into because they are not considered respectable professions, right?
You see that changing, right? That when women were doing IT work overnight, right? That even then, there was a lot of fear and anxiety about what it would look like to work in IT centers as women. In overnight. And there was all sorts of perceptions about those women's sexuality as well. And one of the things that you're pointing out, that I think is really critical about this incredible ongoing movements by sex workers. And I purposely use the category prostitute in the book because historically that's the one that's used to condemn women or to control them legally and structurally. But sex work as work, that's a critical political position for me as a scholar, in part because part of the book is also to demonstrate that certain kinds of work for women, not only sex work, but working as an industrial laborer or as a dancer or as a theater performer, all of those things are also perceived as sexually deviant. And so that sexuality is attached to women's work in many different sites, including but not limited to sex work. And as you say, there's all sorts of questions about consent and all sorts of questions about agency, right? The question of whether a woman has entered sex work. But of course, we don't ask those questions about the most exploitative construction work, that a woman who works in construction, would she want to do construction? There's many kinds of labor that we place women in positions to do because of poverty. And so the real question is about structural violence that's committed onto women, where employment is required because extraordinarily exploitative employment is required because of incredible conditions of poverty and the failure of the state to deal with those women and those families. And one of there's an extraordinary scholar, Prabha Koteswaran, who writes on that language of trafficking and prevention and the way that restricts the freedoms and possibilities of workers, and the way that sex workers have really organized against the exploitation from the law. And one of the themes that you can see in all of our conversation is that really often the people who are exploiting in terms of the law are the police. So they use the Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act as a way to harass women. We can link the language of the Trafficking Prevention Act to now the language of UP and Madhya Pradesh, the so-called love jihad laws, which all are based on the idea that the state has to protect women because women cannot protect themselves.
Nor can they decide for themselves.
They can't decide for themselves. Exactly. If the patriarchal household became one site, that supposedly the freedom of women came because men got to control women, then the second site is, of course, the state. The state takes on a position like the patriarchal household and says, you are vulnerable and we are here to protect you. And unfortunately, one of the things that's complicated is feminists participate in that kind of governance feminisms, again, as Prabha Koteswaran describes it, that kind of idea that to protect women is to give women liberation. And again, that's, like you said, exactly, that how can we imagine women's liberation outside of these paradigms of protection? That, I think, is the kind of exercise that we have to think with now.
And I think that this is a very, very relevant point for a country like India, where, we've been juggling, or rather we've been in this really strange position where our gross domestic product and national income has increased substantially over the last 15 years, but labor force participation of women has decreased immensely. And you see this in both rural and urban India, and you see is that the moment the husband gets a job, which has better payments, better wages, a better working condition, the woman automatically drops out of the labor force. So she could have been doing agricultural wage work, or she could have been working in manufacturing or any of these, because the idea is that it is not respectable work. So this idea of, respectability and women's respectability only being realized when it is within the confines of domesticity is something that has animated conversations about women's work in India. So, they keep saying this is a puzzle and we don't know why this is happening. But I think we know why this is happening, because there is this discourse around, why do women need to work? Only women who, either are in professions which are considered nurturing professions, like being teachers or being doctors, that's okay for them to be in that profession. But the moment it is, and you see this especially in low income households, where a woman going outside for work is almost seen as an automatic invitation for all kinds of abusive behaviors.
One of the things that you pointed out, and I think this is so critically important, is of course the labor of social reproduction as it's described, right? That reproduction is not seen as labor, and the household labor is not seen as labor. And so, feminist economists today have done that, are trying to produce new forms of measure to create new ways to understand what is it that women do. Because if they are not working technically outside of the household, we know they're working all of the time. And so what are they doing? And so that's part of it, is the difficulty of measure. And of course, the lack of compensation of any kind for any kind of household labor. But then as you described, the fear of the sexual deviancy that sits outside of the household. And of course, the household is a figurative idea. It's a legal idea. But the household is often a shanty, right? It's deep poverty. So there's no inside outside. So women are vulnerable to sexual exploitation all of the time. But again, that exploitation is reframed as a language of their own sexual deviancy, as if they are participating in the transgression rather than they're being exploited. This again gets at the idea of the household as this ideal space, marriage as an ideal space, the idea that there can't be something like marital rape. All of this creates the household and marriage as untouchable by Indian law, and as something that can't be penetrated, right? And when it can, it's only for, as you say, Dalit or Bahujan or Adivasi families. It is for Muslim families over and over again. Certain people are vulnerable to state intervention. Most people are not. And it is for us as scholars and for us as feminists today to try to come to terms with, how do we understand that in the last 50 years, there is a proliferation of programs that try to bring women into the economy, bring women into the market and into the labor market, and yet we see a decline. How is it that we can see a proliferation of laws that are supposed to protect women in terms of domestic violence and rape, and yet we see an increase in rape and violence? So how do we understand that contradiction? And in some ways, the law can't be the only site of transforming social practice.
I do want to end on an optimistic note, though, because I feel that there has been quite a bit that has happened, especially in the last 10, 15 years. And I think the voices of young feminists, and, I've taught several of them, I find that quite heartening that many of them are choosing very different pathways to what perhaps would have been the case 20 years ago. So I think that there is a flicker of hope there. But as a lot of young mothers and mothers with both boys and girls, or only with girls, like to say, that we need to bring up our sons just as we are bringing up our daughters, which is to say that, we are making feminists of our daughters, and I have a daughter, and she's certainly going to be one. And I hope that if she ever chooses to go the route of heterosexual marriage, that she chooses someone who has been brought up as a feminist as well. And I think that's part of the problem as well, that this unsettling of male privilege and unsettling of caste privilege, and kind of a more reflective way of bringing up children, where they're not socialized to think that they have a very limited worldview and options, especially girls. That has to change. And some of that is happening in, different quarters. A lot more needs to happen. And I think that would probably be transformative for us in the long run.
I think that's a beautiful way to think about this, right? Which is like, here's a book about 100 years ago, And the question is, how do we live with these legacies, and what do we imagine for the world now? And that imagination can't be the work of just women and feminists alone, and girls. It can't be girls simply pushing against patriarchal structures. It has to come from men who understand that an equitable society produces future possibility for men and for queer people and for transgender people in totally transformative ways. We see this in the aftermath of the Hathras rape case again. Like, yes, extraordinary violence and caste atrocities are here, and we have to bear witness to it. But we also have a new generation of Dalit feminists, of Bahujan feminists, of queer activists who are pointing out that this is not the way we should sustain our society. And that kind of, there are new publications. I read Feminism in India from young people who are finding new ways to articulate these political imaginations. And we saw this with Me Too, right? Like, and all of these movements for women to live in public space and to sit in public space, this is happening now. And so I totally agree with you that we should end with an optimistic note that part of the intent of a book like this or projects like yours and mine is to say we should bear witness to what has happened, to reckon with that history. But then once we've reckoned with that history, we get to imagine anew what we want our world to be.
Well, thank you so much, Durba. It has been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to talk to you and have this really long chat about so many different issues.
Thank you so much.
Durba, Sreeparna, thank you so much for joining us and for having this conversation. And to our listeners, I would say, please go pick up Durba's new book. I think it will be very educational. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was just an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app, and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.